This lecture accompanies Chapter 4 of your textbook, The Personality Puzzle. We're going to talk about the person-situation debate in personality psychology. A fundamental problem for assessing personality is that personality traits are not the only factors that control behavior. Situations are also important. Some situations might make a person more or less shy, more or less careful, or even more or less friendly. So which is more important for determining what people do, the person or the situation? This question is important because it's at the center of how we think about personality. Is personality stable or inconsistent across situations? If it's inconsistent, then that has implications for how we think about individual differences and whether there is likely to be an association between personality and important life outcomes. Situationists argue that behavior is largely driven by the situation and that personality is relatively unimportant. Before we look at the content of this debate, you need to know how the research on personality and behavior has been conducted. Most studies use a correlation coefficient as an effect size. This is important to know because an effect size tells you the strength of the relationship between two variables. So what personality psychology has done is really looked at the correlation between personality traits and behavior, or personality traits and outcomes. A correlation coefficient is just a value that represents the strength of the relationship. And so it can range from -1 to +1. -1 means there's this complete perfect relationship such that when one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. And +1 means that both variables move in the positive direction together. If there's no relationship between two variables, then the correlation is 0. So if more extroversion is related to more talkativeness, then the correlation is in the positive direction. A correlation of 0.4 or 0.5 is moderate to large. Anything below 0.25 is pretty small. So Walter Mischel is credited with starting the person-situation debate, and he argued that there is an upper limit to how well we can predict how someone will behave based on any measure of that person's personality, and that upper limit is low. In other words, personality is not a good predictor of behavior. Traits can't be used to predict behaviors with enough accuracy to be useful. This was his argument anyway. He conducted an extensive review of the literature, looking at studies of self-report, informant report, and behavioral observations to see, in general, if behavior could be predicted from personality traits. Most of the studies he reviewed were based in the lab, and he found that correlations between personality and behavior rarely exceeded 0.3. He argued that these correlations are small, and therefore personality is unimportant and cannot be used to predict behavior. Personality psychologists took issue with these arguments, and they had a number of responses to the situationist claim. Overall, each of these responses reflects the personality psychology perspective that the predictability of behavior from personality traits is better than is sometimes acknowledged. Personality psychologists had 5 responses to the situationist argument. First, they argued that Mischel conducted an unfair selective literature review and that he focused on studies with poor methodology and did not consider a wide range of investigations. 2, personality psychologists argued that the studies reviewed focused on behaviors in the lab and that behaviors in contrived situations aren't important, and to test the effects of personality, studies should focus on real-world behavior or more important behaviors, which are likely to be correlated with personality. Many of the studies used only one measure of a behavior, which opens up the possibility of measurement error since there are random variations in people's trait behavior. So personality psychologists argue that we need to look across several instances and aggregate it and get an average to get rid of that measurement error. They also argued that some people are more consistent than others. Some situations lend themselves to consistency more than others, and some types of behavior might be more consistent than others. Therefore, we need to examine this variation to find out exactly how personality traits relate to behavior. And finally, a correlation of 0.40 is really not that small. If you think about it, the correlation between elevation and temperature is negative 0.34, which is actually lower than 0.40. So how much does the situation matter? Well, we can determine this in a couple of ways. Traditionally, situationalists claimed that situations accounted for whatever personality couldn't account for. So total variance minus variance explained by personality, which would be 1 minus 0.4, which would say situations account for 0.6 or 60% of the variance. But that's not a legitimate way to assess how much the situation matters. The remaining variation after you subtract out some personality variables could still be due to other personality traits or error or only certain aspects of the situation. A better method is using an experimental paradigm. Tons of these throughout social psychology. These are just 3 examples: the cognitive dissonance studies, the bystander intervention studies, and Milgram's experiment. You can look in your textbook for descriptions if you need a reminder of what these studies specifically entailed. But in general, all manipulated aspects of a situation to determine how much of the situation impacted behavior. Funder and Ozer reviewed all of these studies, and overall they found that the situation did matter, but the correlation on average was around 0.3 or 0.4. This is the same effect size that Mischel found between personality and behavior, which shows that personality and situation each contribute to behavior to a similar extent. What about the fact that all people will behave somewhat differently in different situations? How consistent are people? Funder makes the point that consistency in personality doesn't mean acting the same way all the time. When we discuss consistency in personality, we're really talking about relative consistency, not absolute consistency. Personality is all about individual differences. So the question that we should ask, rather than are people consistent, is are these individual differences maintained across situations? Almost everyone will be more talkative at a party than at the DMV, but the people who are very talkative at the party are also more likely to be the most talkative people at the DMV. Funder describes a study of having participants appear at 2 different sessions, and in each of these sessions they talked to another participant. They were told just to chat with this other person. They found that on average, all participants changed their behavior from the first session to the second session. In the second session, people were less anxious, less awkward, more interested, and more involved. But within person, the behaviors were very similar. This table shows that the correlations within person were pretty high from one session to the next. People who spoke in a very loud voice in session 1 were also more likely to speak in a loud voice in session 2. Same thing for laughing a lot or for being unexpressive. This shows that people showed relative consistency across the 2 sessions. Those who were relatively more loud in session 1 were also more loud than others in session 2. Another argument made by situationists is that our perceptions of ourselves and each other are fundamentally flawed, and the professional practice of personality assessment is a waste of time. But personality psychologists say no, personality matters and assessment is not a waste of time. We know this because evidence shows that the effects of personality are large enough to be perceived accurately, and this is discussed at length in Chapter 5. Also, the importance of personality in our culture is reflected in our language. With so many words about patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting, how could personality not be important enough to measure? These large number of trait words in the English language indicate that we need an abundance of trait terms to distinguish between different types of people, and when it comes to personality, one size does not fit all. Personality is important on more than just theoretical grounds. Personality affects and predicts important life outcomes, and over time, how a person behaves adds up. This table in your textbook shows how different personality traits relate to important life outcomes. So you'll see that, for example, extroversion is related to greater happiness, being more attractive, and higher levels of leadership. Neuroticism is related to poor coping, criminal behavior, and poor relationships with one's family. So it is much more likely that interactionism is at play. This is the view that persons and situations are constantly interacting with each other to produce behavior. And there are three main facets of interactionism. One is that the effect of a personality variable might depend on the situation or vice versa. People can change the situations that they're in, and certain types of people go to or find themselves in different types of situations. The Stanford Prison Experiment is a great example of this last facet. Studies after this experiment was done showed that the content of the ad that was used to recruit participants to the Stanford Prison Experiment likely selected for more aggressive and less empathic participants. And this may have caused a greater likelihood that those playing the prison guards would be especially cruel. The resolution of the person situation debate is that one behavioral response does not fit all people in every situation. That is, people can behave in flexible ways to adapt to situations, but they also can have a generally consistent personal style. Situations tell us how people behave under certain circumstances, whereas personality traits tell us how people behave in general. So the conclusion to the person-situation debate is that people are psychologically different, and these differences matter.